So after a long summer of turmoil, what lies ahead for the president? Let's bring in Kimberly Atkins, Washington bureau chief for the Boston Herald. She joins us tonight from Washington. And Philip Bump is a national correspondent with the Washington Post. He's in New York tonight. Well, it certainly appears as though Donald Trump is careening from crisis to crisis. How weak is his position? Kim, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, I mean, look, he's the American president, so in that sense, he still has a very powerful position. But in terms of how he's delivering on his campaign promise to be a sort of the negotiator-in-chief, the business guy who knows how to cut better deals, whether it's with legislation in Congress or trade deals or other agreements with other countries, it's not really panning out. He hasn't achieved any of the major legislative priorities that he set out on the campaign trail or when he entered office, things like repealing and replacing Obamacare or transforming the tax code or changing, passing an infrastructure legislation. All those things so far are stalled, and his ability to be the deal maker, even among members of his own party, hasn't always panned out.
Philip, how would you assess it?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, he certainly is in the most powerful position that is available in government in the United States, if not the world. But he came into it not really understanding what the position was about. And I think the thing that we've seen over the course of the last 8 months is a guy who didn't really understand how the presidency worked, doesn't really understand how it works on Capitol Hill in terms of passing legislation in Congress, doesn't really understand that this isn't a position into which you step and you are suddenly the CEO and you can tell people what to do. He has to work with 535 people on Capitol Hill, all of whom have different priorities, different agendas, and different constituencies, and he has not yet figured out a way to make that work for him. And as a result, it's very severely limited his ability to get things done.
Well, let's focus on Congress for a moment, because if the president himself is faltering in the leadership role, how reasonable is it to expect that Congress is up to the job of getting these legislative initiatives done and dealt with? Kim?
Yeah, I mean, keep in mind, a lot of these agenda items are things that members of Congress, frankly, in both parties, want to get done. In the case of infrastructure reform, for example, or even tax reform, there are Democrats who have some ideas on that. So even without the president, they're incentivized to do something about it. But the problem arises when the president perhaps gets into these Twitter fights that he gets into with members of his own leadership, and that really makes it difficult to really push these agenda items forward. There's also a lot of division within the Republican Party, which is in charge of Congress as well as the White House. So even though Republicans are in control, you have a lot of in-party fighting, which the president, again, hasn't done a great job in sort of bringing them together, corralling, trying to find some consensus. He's better when he has an opponent that he can poke at, and that hasn't always been effective for him.
And just today, Philip, it looked like his opponent was actually the leadership in Congress, as opposed to the Democrats, with the side deal he made with the Democrats. How does that help him deal with Congress on some of these major initiatives that he has promised to get done?
I honestly don't know. I mean, it was an unexpected move, to put it generously. I mean, I think that Donald Trump, he feels as though if he can make a deal with someone, he's willing to make that deal. There are all these constraints that bind the Republicans. As Kim just mentioned, the Republican Party itself is essentially two factions of more moderate Republicans and more conservative Republicans. Trump is very poorly positioned to actually negotiate between those two factions. So I think he saw that he could work with the Democrats on something. He came up with this short-term fix for this debt ceiling issue. But it doesn't really suggest to me over the long term that he's going to be able to work with the Democrats moving forward. First of all, the Democrats are a minority, but second of all, the Democrats have a base which hates Donald Trump with a passion. And so to the extent that Democrats work with Donald Trump, that's not going to do them any good politically. So I think this may be sort of a one-off of Donald Trump trying to get a win under his belt, but it's hard to predict where it goes from here.
Well, let's move to the international stage and talk about how the president deals with the latest international crisis that has captivated attention around the world, the crisis with North Korea. Kim, what position is the U.S. president in to negotiate with North Korea to get North Korea contained or to freeze its nuclear ambitions? How is that in your assessment?
Yeah, I mean, this is tough. This is tough for any U.S. president to try to deal with North Korea. Every expert I talk to says that diplomacy really is the only way, even though that's not a surefire solution. There isn't a military solution here that won't have catastrophic results, but still the president tends to tweet and make statements about, fire and fury that sort of suggests that that's the way he's going. And then we'll see the Secretary of State or other cabinet members sort of walk that back and say, no, we are working with the UN, we are working for a diplomatic solution to this, to try to bring Kim Jong-un to the table and let him know, look, we're not trying to take you out of office, we just need you to stop building this nuclear arsenal and threatening other countries. It seems that the president hasn't quite gotten the hang of it, but members of his team at least are trying.
And how do you think that is perceived, Philip, on the world stage, where the president sends one signal and then his cabinet officials have to come in and make it clear what he really meant or what the U.S. position really is? How does that place the U.S. when it comes to the crisis on North Korea?
Well, I think that situation is not new to the North Korea situation at this moment. I think basically from the early days of his presidency, we saw circumstances in which the president would say one thing and cabinet officials or other government officials would contradict or add more nuance to what he was saying. The North Korea situation, I think, is probably the riskiest situation in which this is happening. There is a very severe downside that is sort of looming over all of us, and Donald Trump's actions, President Trump's actions, suggest that he wants to see something done. He wants to do something, but this is a situation in which there isn't a lot to do besides wait and be slow and talk, as Kim just said, which is not really Donald Trump's style. So I think that this is a particularly tense thing that conflicts with his impulses in terms of how he wants to get things done. But I think that there has been, since the early days of his presidency, been sort of a look at the United States government and President Trump as increasingly different entities. Donald Trump's Twitter account is not the United States government's Twitter account, and I think that people sort of are trying to figure out how that works in this new world.
I'd like to close by asking each of you to quickly respond to how much worse you believe this could get. By that I mean the investigations that the president is staring down from Congress, from the special counsel Mueller. Kim, first to you.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know yet. I mean, that investigation is going to go on for some time. It could result in indictments and all kinds of fireworks, or it could result in nothing. This, much like the investigation into Hillary Clinton during the campaign ended. We don't know yet, but it's definitely a huge cloud hanging over this administration and everything that's happening. It's certainly also a thorn in the side of the president, who absolutely hates anything about Russia or Bob Mueller.
And Philip, last word to you quickly.
I think that's exactly right. And I think that the real risk here for Donald Trump is less the investigation over the short term than him overreacting to it, which we've seen him do repeatedly to his own detriment.
Well, thank you both very much for your thoughts. Appreciate it.